I started telling the other group about the Hisyastus of Tomchei Temimim, making the Yeshiva, Tomchei Temimim, which is the Rebbe RaShaB's Yeshiva. The Yeshiva was made in conjunction with the previous Rebbe's Chasaneh. During the Sheva Brachas, the Yeshiva was announced. And the first Bochurim were Elter Bochurim. They were big boys. Big boys meant in their 20s, early 20s, Mistama, who were in Lubavitch anyway. Because there used to be a system called Yoshvim. Yoshvim means people who came to Lubavitch on their own to learn Chassidus and Darkei Chassidus. You have to understand, Lubavitch did not have yeshivas. Chabad did not have yeshivas. Bechol Chassidim didn't have yeshivas. The Tzemach Tzedek had yeshivas for Ashtikul Tzeit. But Azoi yeshivas were not Chassidim. They were regular yeshivas. They learned Torah. People who were connected to Chassidus had to travel to their Rebbe and to learn Chassidus directly from their Rebbe, and they would move into Lubavitch. Chabad was the kind of Chassidus, you couldn't get it on a weekend. They would come, and they would spend 6 months or a year away from their families, away from everything, and learn, first of all, Limud Chassidus, and then learn Darkei Chassidus, Avodas Chassidus. And these young alike who learned Darkei Chassidus in Lubavitch would go home, and they brought what they learned and the inspiration with them, and they became the Rabbonim, they became the Mashpiim, they became the Shochtim, they became the Malamdim, and they gave, that's how Chassidus was. In those days, the average Lubavitcher was never in Lubavitch. The relation with the Rebbe was through the Mashpia, or through the Rav, who were G'daylim, who would go to Lubavitch and learn Darkei Chassidus. When the Rebbe RaShaB made the yeshiva, really it was the Friedrich Rebbe's request. He took the Yoshim who were already there and he made the yeshiva. And the first thing he did was, he shipped them out of Lubavitch. When they made Tomchei Temimim, the first move was send them away. The Rebbe RaShaB got married. Friedrich Rebbe got married in Elul, Tafresh and Zayin, 1897. Right after Tishrei, Cheshvan, Tafresh and Ches, they sent the Bochurim to Zembin. I don't know how you pronounce it in English. Probably with an H, Zhembin, Zembin. And the whole yeshiva was 10 boys. These boys were very learned and they were advanced in years. They didn't need teachers. They didn't need Rashi Yeshiva. They didn't need anybody to help them with Nigla. They were on their own. They were the brightest boys in Russia, who were the only boys who, I explained to the previous group that the average boy who turned bar mitzvah was done. He didn't learn anymore. He went to work. The only boys who stayed on learning were the very brightest boys. And from those brightest, the brightest of the brightest were taken into these great yeshivas that they had in Russia at that time. And those who were Chassidim would come to Lubavitch as adults to learn Darkei Chassidus. And with them, the Rebbe was miyaseh yeshiva. So when the Rebbe RaShaB made Tomchei Temimim, he gave them a place to sleep, which was not normal. In those days, when you came to yeshiva, you paid your own way. He gave them food, and he gave them teachers, but not for Nigla. When Tomchei Temimim was Nisyaseh, there were no teachers for Nigla at all. Just for Chassidus. Because the Rebbe RaShaB said, there's no shortage of Torah. Pardon me. And the first Bochurim who came to the yeshiva were in their own rights already well-established B'nai Torah, or big Talmidei Chachamim. So the schedule was 8 hours of Nigla and 4 hours of Chassidus, but Nigla, they were on their own. Chassidus, they had teachers. They had a Mashgiach and they had a Mashpia. The Mashgiach took care of the schedule, that they come on time, and they were mamish held to the second. In Tomchei Temimim, you couldn't come 5 minutes late. It was to the minute, eins of eins, to be exactly on time. And the Mashpiim taught them Chassidus, and the Rikid is the Mashpiim taught them Darkei Havodah. Not just the philosophy of Chassidus, but the ways of Chassidus and how to serve Hashem. In other words, Avodah Satfilah. Now, why did the Rebbe send the first Bochurim to Zembin? Why did he send the first Bochurim to Zembin? I have never ever seen in an official record the reason. But I'm going to guess, and this may be a very bad thing to do, because there's a lot written about the early years of Tomchei Temimim, but I've never ever seen the reason why. Because in Zembin there was a young man, who was not so young anymore, he was a middle-aged man, who would become the Mashpia in Tomchei Temimim. He lived in Zembin, he was a Malamed, he was a very poor man. And his name was Reb Shmuel Groinem Esterman. His last name was Esterman, okay? Literally, Esther, Aleph Samach Tov Reish, like Esther Amalka, Man. Reb Shmuel Groinem Esterman, which means his mother or his grandmother, great-grandmother, was a very powerful woman, and the family name was hers. Okay, like Chassidim, his name was Reizes, because the mother name was Roiza, so they were called Reizes, Pinchas Reizes. And there were several Reizes in Lubavitch. Anamanoch and Shviga, that the mother-in-law's name. Rabbi Shmuel Groinem, that was his first name. His name was Esterman. Groinem was a big chassid. He was very, very poor. They say at the end of his life he was blind because as a younger man he would learn chassidus by the light of the moon. Couldn't afford candles. He was a melamed. Melamdim didn't make a lot of money. But he was obsessive about chassidus. He lived in Jembin, which is a very famous city. In Jembin there were two very great chassidim. One was a chassid whose name was Avram of Jembin. He was the Rav. His last name is Landau. You may know Rabbi Landau from Bnei Brak. They're descendants of Avram of Jembin. His last name was Landau. And the other chassid's name was Rabbi Shmuel Ber of Barisa. Shmuel Ber Barisa, he was a chassid from Tzemach Tzedek. He was a big maskell. He knew chassidus incredibly, incredibly well. And this Groinem was makabel from those two chassidim. And his life was chassidus. He breathed and ate chassidus. And when the Rebbe made the yeshiva, he sent the Bochurim to him. That's how I see it. He lived in Jembin. They sent the yeshiva to Bochurim to him. The way, again, now I'm really projecting. He probably got a good raise in his salary from being a malamed of little kids to being a Mashpia. Bochurim probably was an upgrade in his panoseh. But he moved to Lubavitch. Not long after whatever was after, he was not a young man. Before Groinem was by the Tzemach Tzedek yet. So Groinem probably was around 50 when this happened. He was older than the Friedrich Rebbe for sure. He may have been older than the Rebbe RaShaB. When the Rebbe RaShaB was Meyasa Tomchei Temimim, how old was the Rebbe RaShaB? He was around 35. Groinem may have been older than him. It's hard to know. But his family had been grown already. He moved to Lubavitch. And again, in Das Tachtem, when he moved to Lubavitch, the yeshiva moved back with him. When the Meyasa the yeshiva, it was small and mamish elite. The first generation of Temimim, the first 2, 3, 4 years, was very small. Small means 10 Bochurim, 20 Bochurim, 30 Bochurim, hard to know exactly how many. They were all older Bochurim. In other words, they took boys who needed no hadracha and nigle. Meaning to say, if you came to learn on Lubavitch, the assumption was you had already learned in the regular yeshivas, which today you would call them Misnagdish yeshivas, Litvish yeshivas. In Russia, they were just called yeshivas. And you were expert in nigle. And you came to Lubavitch to learn limud chassidus, learning chassidus, and also avodah. So the boys who came in those early years were older. They didn't need to be supervised. They certainly didn't need police, but they didn't need to be helped with their learning. It was very high level. And the only reason to come to Lubavitch was to learn Darkei Chassidus, Limud Chassidus, and Darkei Chassidus, and Avodas Hashem al Derech Chassidus. So in the very, very beginning, he sent the boys to Jembin. I don't know for how long. And again, I'm surmising this. I never saw this in any text, that when the Groinem picked himself up and moved to Lubavitch, the yeshiva moved back with him. In those early years, there were some very, very famous older chassidim who were still alive. The very, very first Bochurim were zeicha to see a chassid by the name of Reb Chanech Hendel Kugel. Hendel, he was called. He was a chassid of Tzemach Tzedek. He lived in Lubavitch. He passed away very early on. He lasted just a few years. After 13 years, he passed away. The earliest Talmidim saw Hendel. The Friedrich Rebbe thought about Hendel was he had an average mind. He wasn't so bright. He wasn't such a scholar. But he had a heart of a lion. The Friedrich Rebbe writes normally, a person with a big heart has to have a big brain. He was a person with an average mind, but an incredibly great heart. He was a great chassid, a very deep chassid. And he taught avodah. That's what he do. Davened. He davened all day long. And the Bochurim who saw him and learned from him never forgot it. They would name their children after him. He was left in a great impression. Another Mashpia, who was from the senior mashpiim in those early years, was a very special chassid by the name of the Rashbatz, Rabbi Shmuel Betzalel Sheptel. You may have read his biography. It's in the Hatomim. Rashbatz was the private tutor of two Rebbes. When the Rebbe RaShaB was a young man, his father, the Rebbe Marash, hired the Rashbatz to tutor him. And when the Friedrich Rebbe was a young man, the Rebbe RaShaB hired his former tutor to tutor his son. So what kind of man must the Rashbatz have been if he was zoichet to be madrich two Rebbes were his talmidim, private? The end of his life, he moved to Lubavitch. And the Bochurim got to see him, the Rashbatz. He was on a tzir. And there were others. I mean, I don't want to go through the list of mashpiim because it's besides everything else, it's kind of boring. But the Mashpia that really went through all the years of Lubavitch was Groinem. He was the Mashpia. If you hear stories from Elter Chassidim, right? We have Sfarim that are printed of Temimim who learned in Lubavitch. Rabbi Fala Khan wrote Sfarim. Yudel Chitrik wrote Sfarim. Chaimot Kapelov wrote a Sefer. Zalman these are people learned in Lubavitch, wrote the stories. 80% of the stories in those books have the same source. Greinim. Greinim was the Mashpia. He taught them Haskalah. He was a very big fashtei and still Chassidus well. He taught them how to learn. And he fabrein a lot. And he told Sipurim, he told stories. And the stories that we have that are not from the Friedrich Rebbe himself, I would say a significant percentage, well over 50%, which come from all different kinds of older Chassidim. They all were in Lubavitch, and they heard these stories from Reb Greinim. He was sort of the central Mashpia. He wasn't the biggest personality. He davened with a minion. Greinim was not an oived. He davened with a minion. The Friedrich Rebbe described him as a man who was always raising money for tzedakah. He was always busy helping people. But he was a Masud, he was organized, he davened with a minion, he knew a Gvald Chassidus, his life was understanding Chassidus. And the Rabbeim brought him to Lubavitch, the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe RaShaB, or the Rebbe RaShaB and the Friedrich Rebbe, brought him to Lubavitch to be Madrich the Bochurim because they felt that he understands Chassidus and he could teach it to them. And the Chassidus that we learn today, we are students of Greinim, you understand? That's how it is. With the Chassidus that we learn, who did we learn from? From Rabbi. Rabbi learned from his Mashpiim. It goes back to Greinim. Greinim was like the big maven. And again, I'm assuming that when he moved to Lubavitch, that's when the yeshiva moved to Lubavitch. The yeshiva was very small. Of course, the famous dates in the history of Tomchei Temimim. Number one, Simchas Torah Tafresh and Tes, Simchas Torah of 1898. The yeshiva was a little more than a year old. And in the Hayom Yom, it's written a little different, but the Friedrich Rebbe describes how it happened. The Rebbe RaShaB was going to Simchas Torah, doing Takofis. And the Rebbe got the first Takof and the last Takof, which was by older Rabbeim. And the Rebbe RaShaB was holding the Sefer Torah. And the last Takof, right, there's 7 Takofas. Every Takof, you read 3 Oises of Aleph Beis, right? Elokei Haruches, Beichin Levaves, Girl Chazak, Aleph Beis Gimel. David Meisharim, whatever it is, Hoige Deis, Vasi B'Chassid is, right? But 6 times 3 is 18. So 7 times only 21. So you do the last Takofa, you do Kodesh V'nei Rashiana, Rachav V'chan Natzlichana, Shemer B'is, and then you say Tamim Chapim V'shiana, Tamim Ma'asav Aslichana. There's 3 tofs. One of the 3 tofs is Temech Temimim V'shiana. And the Rebbe RaShaB is walking, he's holding the Sefer Torah, and the Chazan is walking ahead of him, and he's reading after him. So when the Chazan says, the Rebbe RaShaB stops walking. In the middle of the sentence. And he says, the yeshiva that we were miyased with the help of our Hilik Azadias more than a year ago doesn't have a name. So now, in the middle of, as he's holding the Sefer Torah, in the middle of his Hakafa, he says the name of the yeshiva is Tomchei Temimim. And the people who learn in the yeshiva and are misnahik, berucha, behave according to the spirits of Tomchei Temimim are called Temimim. So in the middle of Hakafa, he says, the name of the yeshiva is, it's a funny name for a yeshiva, I gotta tell you. Because you know what Tomchei Temimim means? Anybody know Hebrew? Temimim means you support the sincere. Tomchei Temimim it's not the name of the yeshiva, it's the supporters. Temimim means a supporter, someone who supports Torah, Temimim. The Rebbe RaShaB named the yeshiva Tomchei Temimim, the supporters of Temimim. And those who learn in the yeshiva and are misnag, Berucha, are called Temimim. The Rebbe used to say, you never learned in Lubavitch, but you behave like a Tamim behaves, so you're a Tamim. And the Rebbe RaShaB explained, the Friedrich Rebbe explains in the Sichas that the word Tamim has 3 translations. Because when the Rebbe RaShaB was miyased at the yeshiva and he envisaged Temimim, there were 3 ideas. Number 1, Tamim means whole, full. That means full of nigla, full of chassidus. The Kenan Lenin, Lei Amaretz Chassid. To be a Tamim, you have to know how to learn nigla and chassidus. Number 1. Number 2, you have to be serious. Tamim is not ernst, earnest. And number 3, Tamim means sincere. Like a simple faith, no kashas. The 3 translations of the word Tamim is sincere and earnest and full of Torah. Usually smart people are not so sincere. The Rebbe RaShaB wanted a yeshiva with the Bochurim of full of Torah, and yet their relation with the Eibishter was sincere, serious and sincere. This was Simchas Torah Tafresh Nun Tes, when the yeshiva was a little bit more than a year old.
So there was no name before?
There was no name. It was the yeshiva. Lubavitch Yeshiva, they called it.
So what's the reason for the Tomchei?
Das tachten weiß ich nicht. The Havana Shabbat is that this is a yeshiva that creates Temimim. So the yeshiva is supporting. Tomchei Temimim doesn't mean people to write the checks. Tomchei Temimim means an environment that Hadav is that raises people who are going to be Temimim. It's supporting Temimim in the Ruchni's dicka sense. That's how I understand it. 2 years later, Simchas Torah Tafresh Tamach Aleph, the yeshiva was now a little bit more than 3 years old. So there's two different things that happened that are very compelling. One of them is, the yeshiva was 3 years old.
What year was it established?
It was established in 1897. It got its name at the end of 1898. So the story I'm telling you now was 1900. The yeshiva was 3 years and a few weeks old. Simchas Torah Tamach Aleph, the two things happened at Simchas Torah. One of them is, the Rebbe said the famous Sikha of Kol HaYetzel Mechamas Beis David, which you know about.
Sikha or Maimar?
It's a Sikha. Kol HaYetzel is a Sikha. My man. The Rebbe sometimes calls it. It's a Sikha. Kol HaYetzel Mechamas Beis David, the Rebbe didn't print it in the Torah Shalom, which is hard to understand. Our Rebbe printed the Sikha of the Rebbe RaShaB. The Sikha of Kol HaYetzel he didn't put into it. It's printed in the Sofas of the Friedrich Rebbe Sikhas, in Tafshin Beis. The Sikha of Kol HaYetzel Mechamas Beis David we have. But it's not printed amongst the Sikhas of the Rebbe RaShaB. It's printed amongst the Sikhas of the Friedrich Rebbe, and they suffer as the Sikhas Tafshin Beis. Why, I don't know. It's a long Sikha. And the Sikha began with a Gemara. If you go out to fight the war of Beis David, you would write your wife a divorce. There was a problem in the times of the first Beis HaMikdash. Men would go to battle and they wouldn't come home. And the women were agonis nebuch. They were trapped. They couldn't remarry because there was no witnesses. So you gave your wife a divorce. And you came back after the war, you remarried her. What if you were a kohen? A kohen can't give his wife a divorce because he can't marry a gerusha. So you gave her a get out night. So the expression of the Gemara is, this was a pashta halacha, Kol HaYetzel Mechamas Beis David, if you were a warrior for David HaMelech, and there was a real concern that you would be lost in battle, get krisis case of the ishta, you wrote your wife a divorce. That's the push at the taich. But the Rebbe didn't get that. Kol HaYetzel Mechamas Beis David, the person goes out to fight the war to bring Moshiach Tzidkenu, get krisis case of the ishta, he has to be prepared to divorce himself from all Gashmi's interests. It says in Zoyar about Avram and Sarah, Chai Sarah, right? This week, you have it in Kutsichas. The Avram, Lifkes, the Sarah of a Lifkes, goes on the Neshama and the Guf. So if you want to go out to fight the war of the Melech, you have to divorce. In other words, the cost of being a Tamim is that you can't expect, you're not entitled to a Gashmi is Dika life. Kol HaYetzel Mechamas, and that's how the Rebbe started the Sikha. That's how he explained it. And then the Rebbe explained at length what he wanted, the Rebbe RaShaB. Much of that Sikha is very hard for us to relate to because we're not in that world. He spoke about emes. The Rebbe RaShaB spoke about emes. And emes means that when you learn Torah, you remember that's Hashem's. And the most important thing in learning Torah is not to come up with new ideas, new chedushim, but to understand it correctly. And not to make pilpulim shel hevel, not to learn Torah and spend your whole gishmak and trying to come up with new ideas and blow wind and sound smart, but you have to look for the emes. And the Rebbe RaShaB was very, very passionate about that because there were big yeshivas, there were very big yeshivas in Russia, but a lot of people treated the Torah like it was their toy, like the Torah was their ego, the Torah was their greatness. And the Rebbe said, Chassidus teaches us that when you're learning Torah from the Eibishter, there has to be a humility, there has to be a bittul. There has to be a sense of the sacredness of it, the schus that we're able to learn it. And when you learn Torah, the only things that matters is that you remember that it's Hashem's, and you learn it with the appropriate humility, and you don't look to find ways of creating a new Torah, but rather to try and understand the emes of Torah. That's one of the things that dominates that sikha. And he also talked about avodas tefillah, about davening. But of course, the part of the sikha that you know, which is mind-blowing, is that in 1900, in Tafresh Tamachav, the Rebbe RaShaB said, that the Gemara says, Ibra Isa Deirach Adir, Mecharef u'Magadif, Tzapei l'Raglo Shel Mashiach, which means, if you see one generation and then a second generation of Jews that are apokursim, blaspheming apokursim, expect Mashiach to show up. Because it says in the end of Kapitel Peites and Tilim, Asher cherfu ikris Mashiach, Asher cherfu evecha Hashem, Asher cherfu ikvis mishichecha. What's the next pasuk? Nobody knows. Baruch Hashem lo'elam amen v'yamin. Asher cherfu ivecha Hashem is one generation. Chiruf means to speak apocryphals. Asher cherfu ikvis mishichecha. Another generation. Baruch Hashem lo'elam amen v'yamin goes on Moshiach. So the Gemara says if you see 2 generations in a row that are going to speak apocryphals, expect Moshiach to come. So the Rebbe RaShaB said, I am making a yeshiva to produce the Talmidim who are going to be Yosi למלחמת based over to fight this war. And he explained, the Rebbe RaShaB explained, and it's printed. I have classes on it that I gave in my Moshiach syllabus where I quote from the Sikha. The Rebbe RaShaB, there's going to be 2 generations coming up. He says, one generation will be Yidden or Apocryphal. They deny the whole Torah. They come out and fight war against Hashem Mashiach. And then after them is going to be another generation, says the Rebbe RaShaB, of Frume Elach Yidden, who are B'nai Torah. But when you say the word Moshiach, they're going to go to war against it like as if it's a klippah. And the Rebbe says it's going to be one generation. The Rebbe said 2 Yovelos. A Yovel is 50 years, a jubilee. First is going to be a Yovel of Cherfa Evecha Vaye. People are going to fight against the Eibishter. And second is going to be a Yovel, which is going to be from a Yidden. You say the word Mashiach, it's like a dirty word. There's a Mashiach. So I heard myself from the Rebbe. I was at the Fabringen, and I've since found the Sikh where the Rebbe said that when the Rebbe RaShaB said this, you have to understand, now it's 123 years since he said it. The Rebbe said it was Nevuah Bruder. It was open prophecy. There's no way the Rebbe RaShaB could have known in 1900 what was going to happen. Remember, you had World War I just a few years later. Along with World War I came the Bolshevik Revolution. And millions of Jewish girls, millions and millions of Jews threw the tefillin into the ocean. They fried out so fast. It's hard to understand how quickly it was. Millions of Yidden lost their Yiddishkeit. Between 1890 and 1940, I always say the same thing. In 1890, 9 out of 10 Jews in the world was frum. In 1940, 9 out of 10 Jews in the world was not frum. How did it happen? And the Rebbe RaShaB was sitting in 1900 when none of this was yet visible. And he says, this is what's going to happen, and this is why I'm making this yeshiva. There's going to be a generation of Jews who are going to fry out completely, and this is the Melchamet's base David. These soldiers, these Temimim. It was a handful of Chavre, the whole yeshiva was a few Bochurim at that time, are going to fight this war. And then there's going to be another generation who's going to fight against Moshiach. And the Moshiach is like a bad idea. And I'm creating Temimim to fight these 2 battles. Today, you look back, and you see how the Rebbe RaShaB predicted exactly what he said happened. B'diuk. Exactly how he predicted it. But the Rebbe RaShaB, the Rebbe called it, I was there, I heard it from them myself, on the Vua Bruder, an open prophecy. So the Rebbe RaShaB said, I'm making the yeshiva. Right now, you're sitting and learning and davening, and what I'm telling you is, when you learn Torah of the Eibishter, you should remember that it's the Eibishter's and not your own. And when you daven, you have to daven to the Eibishter. He spoke about Nyanim Pnimiyim, but he explained why. I made this yeshiva in anticipation of what's coming. And boy, was it coming. And when he said it, when the Rebbe RaShaB said it, it really was impossible to know. The writing was not on the wall. In 1905, maybe you could start seeing it, but when the Rebbe said it, it was Pashat prophecy, predicted. This was Simchas Torah, Tov Reish Samach Aleph.
What was the Melchama against Moshiach?
The Melchama against Moshiach, since the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe started speaking about Moshiach 80 years ago. You could think Mashiach is a bad word. In the frum world, it's like such a terrible thing, Chas v'Shalom, to mention Mashiach. When the Friedrich Rebbe spoke about Mashiach 80 years ago, the Misnagdim came out against. They call us Eved Aveda Zara, because we say, Rachman al-Islam, that was Mashiach, as if it's a big Aveda. Mashiach became a bad word. It's unbelievable. It's so hard to understand. Mashiach is a bad, not allowed to say it. Mashiach punished. 80 years ago, when the Rebbe said, Li'al Tov L'Tshuvah, as soon as he said it, they came out against it. Okay, Baruch Hashem. But now Mashiach has to come upon Mamish. But we lived through a period when people fought against Mashiach. Why? Mashiach is 13 principles of faith. And in Maya Emunah Shlem B'Yis HaMashiach, and the frumest Yidden, the biggest of the Chachamim, fought against it. They have some kind of a disease. And the Rebbe RaShaB predicted it 40 years before. 40 years before. The other thing that happened at Simchas Torah, which is so painful, but I'm going to say it. He called the Bochurim. He said, "Oh, whoever learned, come stand in front of me." Now, I'm sure they were not all there. Some of them were already married. Remember, they were Chatchila elder. But that Simchas Torah, there was a collection of young alait who either were still Bochurim or who had newly married, and they were in Lubavitch Yom Tov. And the Rebbe called all the Bochurim of the Yeshiva who had learned in the Yeshiva in the 3 years until that point. And they stood in front of him, and the Rebbe RaShaB tells him like this. So when you plant a tree, the first 3 years is Allah. What Allah means? It's asar ba'anoah. Not only you can't eat it, you can't even sell it. It's treif. It's treif chassid. The 4th year is revoy. You have to bring it to the Beis HaMikdash. The 5th year is yours. So the Rebbe said, what we did for the first 3 years is Allah. You're the practice run. That's what he told them. The erste 3 Jahre Shneis Allah. With you, the yeshiva was nisyaset, and the Rebbe sort of told them that the yeshiva's real fruit are beginning now. The Friedrich Rebbe says, I was standing there, Friedrich Rebbe. You imagine the Rebbe says that to you, thank you for learning about yeshiva. We practiced on you, now putting you in the garbage, and we're going to start to do. He didn't say putting you in the garbage, but he said the erste Jahre Friedrich Rebbe says he saw them standing there, and they were bawling. They were so, by the way, those first Bochurim were Shene Yidden. The Rav of Kfar Chabad for the first 25 years, Arav Garelik, was from those Bochurim. But that's what the Rebbe told them. The first 3 years is developing the patent, as it were, the recipe. And after that, it's Chani Yeshiva. And the Rebbe told it to them. It was very moving, very emotional, and very strong. They had to be a certain kind of person to hear that from a Rebbe and not come to pieces. But that's what the Rebbe told them. Now the Hemshech HaSipur, the continuation of the story of Tomchei Temimim is that in the very, very beginning, it took only older Bochurim. I'm just trying to see the time. It took only older Bochurim, and they were really on their own. But after a few years, there was a huge demand to take more Bochurim and to take younger Bochurim. Now younger Bochurim is a big headache. Why? Younger Bochurim have to worry about their emotional health. I mean, dealing with 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds who've been on their own for years, you just teach them Torah. Younger Bochurim have to worry about their emotional health, and the ikin is you need to teach them. You can't just put them in a room and say, learn. And as time passed, Tomchei Temimim became a bigger and bigger yeshiva, meaning there are more and more Talmidim. Tomchei Temimim in its heyday, in its best years, had 300 elder Bochurim sitting in the zal, 300, learning Torah, day and night. My brother told me that he heard from a Mayor who learned in Lubavitch. He says, Nigla was 8 hours, from 11:30 in the morning till 7:30 at night. You sat down across from Yechavrusa, and you didn't raise your head for 8 hours. You didn't budge. The asmada, the environment was so conducive to learning. You sat down at 11:30 in the morning, you didn't raise your head. You learned straight, 8 hours, on no fed. They only stopped for mincha in the wintertime. The hasmada was unbelievable. The level of learning and the level of the Bochurim was very, very high. And they learned a whole day nigla. Chassidus was in the morning, Chassidus was at night, and from 11:30 till 7:30 was nigla. And they learned non-stop. But they also took in younger Bochurim. The younger Bochurim were called the Chadarim. Chadarim is what you and I would call high school age. Between Bar Mitzvah and like 16, 17, and then you quote went into the Zal. The Bochurim and the Chadarim, they had to provide them with teachers and madrichim. So Tomchei Temimim became a real yeshiva with real budgets, real expenses, had to hire teachers, had to hire mashgichim. It was all very, very expensive. The Friedrich Rebbe was responsible to pay the bills. In the beginning, there was a lot of money. In the very beginning, there was tons and tons of money. There was always enough money because there were some very rich Chassidim, and then those Chassidim ran out of money. But Chassidim, Tomchei Temimim didn't run out of bills. So, and at a later date, Tomchei Temimim really suffered. But the yeshiva was very big and very successful, and it began to broaden. Broaden means take younger and younger kids. So there's a few things that I want to share with you about the broadening of Yeshiva Tomchei Temimim. Number one, they started to make branches of Tomchei Temimim in other cities. There were families, there was Shtedrin, and there was all kinds of places where they would send Jungalite, Lubavitchers who were married to a city, to start an outpost of Tomchei Temimim, and then the Rebbe would send from Lubavitch Bochurim, younger Bochurim, older Bochurim, to run different branches of Tomchei Temimim in different places. I don't remember all the cities, but there were many places where they made branches of Tomchei Temimim. And number two, because the yeshiva got bigger, they needed to hire staff. So a few stories. Number one, there's a printed letter, that when the Friedrich Rebbe comes to his father, the Rebbe RaShaB, who was the miyased of the yeshiva, and by the way, before I tell you this, let me just tell you something. The Rebbe RaShaB agreed to make the yeshiva at the behest of his son, the Friedrich Rebbe. But when they made the yeshiva, the Rebbe RaShaB treated the Bochurim like his own children. The Rebbe RaShaB never called the Temimim. He never called the Temimim Talmidim. He called them the kinder. When the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe RaShaB used to talk, the Rebbe RaShaB referred to them as the kinder, as the children. That's how they looked at them. The Rebbe Tzendivke, the Rebbe RaShaB's mother, who was very much alive when the Miyasa Tomchei Temimim. So when they were talking about making the yeshiva, the Rebbe RaShaB went into his mother and said to his mother, I'm thinking to make a yeshiva. And she says, it's a great idea. So he says to his mother, but there's no money. You have to understand, she paid the bills. He was the Rebbe, she paid the bills. The Rebbe Tzendivke had to pay the bills for her son to Rebbe. And she didn't always have a lot of money. It was hard. Chassidim came and they gave her money. But the Rebbe's, the Hitzahs of the Beis Harav were on her. Rebbe Tzendivke she was responsible for the Hitzah, for the whole family. Well, there's a lot of details and a lot of stories, but the bottom line is the Rebbe RaShaB lived in Lubavitch. His brothers moved to Lubavitch. She had to pay the bills. And the Rebbe said, I want to make yeshiva. Great idea. So he says to his mother, Aber Mama, was sollen sie essen? Mama, mother, what are they going to eat? So she says, was heißt? Was middle essen, sollen sie essen? Whatever will eat, they'll eat. That's how it was. Later on, the Rebbe Tzendivke was the head of what you would call today the ladies' auxiliaries of Tomchei Temimim. And they built a building out of brick. Everything in Lubavitch was made out of wood, which was burnt. The one building was made of stone, was the kitchen. It was her. The Rebbe Tzendivke raised money from women all over Russia to build a place for the Bochurim to have meals in the yeshiva rather than eating in people's homes. And that building was made of stone. So when all the buildings in the Chotzer were destroyed, that one stone building remained. That building is gone now. Because people took the bricks and put them in their own homes. But that survived all the fires. The Rebbe Tzendivke, she oversaw it. They raised a lot of money. She built a building. And the Bochurim should have to eat a dining room, basically. A kitchen and a dining room. That was her thing. So the attitude of the Rabbeim towards the Bochurim was very intimate. The Rebbe Chaim Mushka was born in Samach Aleph, right? In 1901. So she when she was born, there was already Bochurim learning. As she was growing up, she watched generation of Bochurim. I never met Rebbe Chaim Mushka. If I would see her on the street, I would not recognize her. I really would not know how she looked. But people who knew her said that she talked about Lubavitch and about the Temimim. You felt like she was talking about her own brothers. The pride and the love she felt towards the yeshiva. She was a girl. And her parents kept her locked up in the house. Their mamash kept her locked up in the house. They went no place. It was only Bochurim. But she talked about Lubavitch with such nostalgia, with such a memory. She talked about the Bochurim. Mamash, when she talked about the Temimim and Lubavitch, you felt like she was talking about her own brothers. That's how the whole Beis Harav felt about Tomchei Temimim. That was the mood. That was the feeling. But the yeshiva became bigger and bigger, and they had to provide all kinds. So I just want to continue this thought. The Rebbe RaShaB, the Bochurim went into the Rebbe RaShaB to Yechidus. And the Rebbe RaShaB was madich every Bochurim. He gave very specific instructions how each Bochurim should, what he should do. Some Bochurim should learn, some Bochurim should daven. And there was a lot of complications. Like the Rebbe RaShaB would tell a Bochur that he should daven barichas. Daven long. No, if you daven long, come late to Seder. Come late to Seder, the Manal, the Mashgiach punishes you. What's the punishment? You can't eat lunch. In Lubavitch, if you couldn't eat lunch, you couldn't go to the store, to the machine and put in $1 and take out a candy. A, there was no machine. B, you didn't have $1. The person starved. So the Rebbe told the Baruch of Daven Barichis, and the Holler said, what do you missed? You came late to Seder, no lunch. And after you suffered for a while, the wires would get aligned. It was part of the test. A lot of Bochurim, it was too hard, so they said, you know what, the Rebbe told me to daven, but I got to eat, so they started davening with the minyan. But the Bochurim who stuck it out, after a period of time, the Hanola was told by the Rebbe RaShaB, he can eat even if he comes late to Seder. But it was part of the way the chinuch was. There was a lot of challenges in Lubavitch. And the Bochurim who were special, and not all of them were special, the average Bochur kept Seder. The Chassidus in the morning, Nigla all day long, but the Bochurim who were the Yetzis Min HaKlal, there was a whole Seder of how, as they say in the culture, you were brought into a Inyanim Pnimi, you were brought into more Inyanim Pnimius of Avodah. And in those early years, the Rebbe RaShaB was like a Mashpia. In my imagine, when I think about Tomchei Temimim, I think about, imagine being in a yeshiva where your Mashpia is the Rebbe. Your Mashpia is the Rebbe. That kind of closeness, to me, it's overwhelming. To be close to a Rebbe, by the way, it sounds like a lot of fun. It's a lot more fun to be far away. Being too close to a Rebbe, you burn up. Because you're not a half a Rebbe, you're not a quarter Rebbe, you're nothing. To be so close to a Rebbe, it's ask the Rebbe secretaries. It was an impossible job You could never be good enough. You could never come close to be good enough. In Tomchei Temimim Bochurim, the Bochurim Mashpia was the Rebbe RaShaB.
Why do they need to be good enough?
You're asking logical questions. I'm telling you, the fact was that this proximity created Superman. The Bochurim were learning Tomchei Temimim. Their hadracha came directly from the Rebbe. They became so great. You know, the Rebbe RaShaB boasted. Somebody once told the Rebbe RaShaB at the Tomchei Temimim moved back the clock 50 years. So the Rebbe RaShaB said 100 years, maybe more. What that means? The Rebbe RaShaB chaged with the Temimim, and they became such big balei madregi at Bochurim for davening all day long. They were like madreges tzaddik. They were incredibly great people. Some of them. The Rebbe RaShaB personally was their madrich. Now, what you need to remember is that was a very select group. Tomchei Temimim was a big yeshiva. There are 3 of the Bochurim in the yeshiva. The Bochurim who the Rebbe RaShaB had that relationship with was 10 Bochurim, 15 Bochurim, and they were hand-picked. It wasn't open season. The Rabbi used to call you in, or you would go into Yechidus, if the Rebbe felt Moshiach and Yonim Pnimiyim. So there was a special adracha. It was exclusive. It was separate. It was different. So there was a regular yeshiva with many boys, and then there were the ones whose names we know, you understand, who were extraordinary. But this is how Tomchei Temimim developed over time. Anyway, I just want to tell you, I got to let you go. Yeah, I got 2 minutes. The Frierdiker Rebbe comes to his father, and he says to his father, we have to hire a Rosh Yeshiva. We have younger Bochurim, and they need teachers. Until then, they were on their own. We need to hire a Rosh Yeshiva. So the Rebbe RaShaB wrote his son a letter, which is printed in Igros Kodesh. I once showed this letter to one of the Rosh Yeshivas. He wanted to rip my head off. The Rebbe RaShaB writes that in the olden days, they had a Rosh Yeshiva. What was a Rosh Yeshiva? A guy sat in his room, sat in his medrash, and learned Torah on a very high level. He gave shiurim on a high level, but the Bochurim was so dedicated to Rosh Yeshiva that they would spend all the time they needed to understand every shiur. If you have a Rosh Yeshiva with a real God, you don't understand what he knows. You don't even begin to understand what he knows. So when you listen to his shiur, you have to study it. If you listen to one shiur, and to a second shiur, and to a third shiur, and you spend as much time as you need, one of the biggest problems Bochurim have is they're in a rush. And when a Bochur learns Torah in a rush, he doesn't do nothing. He's wasting his time. You cannot learn Nigla, Gemara, or even see this. You have to have patience. You have to learn how to have patience. So the Rebbe writes, the Rebbe RaShaB wrote this 120 years ago. 50 years ago, which is by today 170 years ago, the Bochurim and the Yeshivas had enough bittul to the Rosh Yeshivas. The Yeshiva gave a shiur, and the Bochurim used to study a shiur, and by studying the shiurim, they learned how to learn from their teachers, derech halimud. So the Rebbe says the Bochurim now don't have enough discipline, enough bittul. 120 years ago, the Rebbe RaShaB wrote that. So today we're what? We're all Moshiach. We're all the best people who ever lived, right? Why? We're about to be better than them. Yeah. But so the Rebbe RaShaB says we don't need Rosh Yeshivas. We need mashgiach. What's a mashgiach? He goes to the Bochurim and he talks to the Bochurim and learning what the Bochurim are holding. Instead of the Rosh Yeshiva giving a shiur what he's holding, and the Bochurim come to him, the Rosh Yeshiva goes, the Mashkiach goes to the Bochurim, and he's talked to the Bochurim, and the Bochurim are holding. In Tomchei Temimim and Lubavitch, do a shulchanos, tables, big tables. Every table had between 8 and 10 Bochurim, and there could be 30 or 40 tables. The Rebbe RaShaB said any Bochur in Yeshiva could learn anything he wanted. It wasn't like today. All the Bochurim were learning Masechta Gittin. In all the Lubavitch Yeshivas, Masechta Gittin. In Lubavitch, every table was a different sugi. Here they're learning Gittin, here they're learning Ksubas, here they're learning Zvachim, here they're learning Menachas, here they're learning Brachas, here they're learning Yeridei. Every table was a different world. The Rebbe RaShaB had one rule, that all the Bochurim at the same table have to be learning the same thing, so there should be people that talk amongst themselves. When they hired a Mashgiach, there's a whole story about this. The Mashgiach went from table to table, talking to every group where they were holding. So the Mashgiach had to basically know Kol HaTorah Kula. He went from table to table. And each table was another world. And you had to speak to the Bochurim in such a way we were able to be madich. So Rebbe RaShaB writes, Yeshivas, guys would give great shiurim, that was in the olden days. Today, you need someone who's going to talk to the Bochurim.